Welcome to today's session of the NPTEL course titled Introduction to World Literature. Today I would like to introduce to you the text, the short story Diary of a Madman, written by Nikolai Gogol. Gogol was an Ukrainian writer. He wrote in Russian and his works have been translated into different languages including English. It is said that Gogol is one of the first writers who acquired an international celebrity status from among the Russian writers. He is also said to be a very influential literary artist of his times who also laid the foundations of Russian realism. So many of the prominent Russian writers that we know of today, they all had been immensely influenced by Gogol, and in that sense it is very apt to consider Gogol as one of the starting points of modern Russian literature. And Diary of a Madman is one of his best known stories among the other very prominent ones such as The Overcoat, The Nose. This work was published in 1835. Though this is almost 2 centuries old now, we continue to see that there's a relevance with which the text continues to be discussed, especially within the context of world literature. And there is a certain universality about most of Gogol's stories, and Diary of a Madman is one of such typical ones where we both get a sense of how the Russian bureaucracy works, and we also get a sense of how certain universal emotions which are part of the bureaucratic frustrations that have also been portrayed very in an almost perfect manner. Diary of a Madman, as the title implies, it is in the form of a diary entry. It's a diary maintained by the protagonist Bob Rishkin, and this is a diary which he interestingly maintains for himself, and this is not meant for public reading as we would figure out as when we progress through the short story. This is written in the form of different entries based on dates, the first one being October 3rd. And the way he dates these occurrences, that also gives us a sense into this this protagonist's state of mind. So if we try to summarize this story in a single line, this could be said as the story about a man who gradually descends into complete madness. So we get a sense of the progression of his insanity when we look at the way in which he dates his entries among many other things. And there is a section towards the end when he enters the year as year 2000 and the date as April 43rd. And so by then we get a sense that he has lost all comprehension of time. There is no true sense of time within which he positions himself, and that the descent into madness is almost complete. Right at the outset, I also read some excerpts for you from that, we get a sense of who this protagonist is. The Diary of a Madman, October 3rd. A strange occurrence has taken place today. I got up fairly late, and when Mavra brought me clean boots, I asked her how late it was. When I heard it had long struck 10, I dressed as quickly as possible. To tell the truth, I would rather not have gone to the office at all today, for I know beforehand that our department chief will look as sour as vinegar. For some time past, he has been in the habit of saying to me, "Look here, my friend, there's something wrong with your head. You often rush about as though you were possessed. Then you make such confused abstracts of the documents that the devil himself cannot make them out. You write the title without any capital letters and add neither the date nor the docket number. The long-legged scoundrel. He is certainly envious of me because I sit in the director's workroom and mend His Excellency's pens. In a word, I should not have gone to the office if I had not hoped to meet the accountant and perhaps squeeze a little advance out of this skinflint. A terrible man, this accountant. As for his advancing one's salary once in a way, you might sooner expect the skies to fall. You may beg and beseech him, and be on the very verge of ruin. This great devil won't budge an inch. At the same time, his own cook at home, as all the world knows, boxes his ears. I really don't see what good one gets by serving in our department. There are no plums here. In the fiscal and judicial offices, it's quite different. There some ungainly fellow sits in a corner and writes. He has such a shabby coat and such an ugly mug that one would like to spit on both of them. But you should see what a splendid country house he has rented. He would not condescend to accept a gilt porcelain cup as a present. You can give that to your family doctor, he would say. Nothing less than a pair of chestnut horses, a fine carriage, or a beaver fur coat worth 3,000 rubles would be good enough for him. And yet he seems so mild and quiet and asks so amiably, "Please lend me your penknife. I wish to mend my pen." Nevertheless, he knows how to scarify a petitioner till he has hardly a whole stitch left on his body. So we begin to get a drift of this short story right at the outset. Here is a protagonist whose name we will get to know later, Poprishchin, who is highly dissatisfied with the kind of job that he is doing. He does not seem to be eager to leave for work, and he is very dissatisfied. He is pretty much disgruntled about everything at work, and we find that he continues to exhibit this sense of paranoia throughout this short story, and his descent into madness is also very vigorously intertwined with the bureaucratic systems within which he is caught. So we come across a range of frustrations, frustrating incidents, and also humiliations that this protagonist is receiving from his authorities higher up. And there is a sense of vengeance that he begins to develop against the world. And there are two ways in which he tries to vent his anger. One, at his workplace by writing out the documents, and secondly by writing out this diary to himself. And we get an access to this diary, and we also get a sense of what's happening inside his mind. One is not too sure about the veracity of the incidents that are being recorded. For instance, he talks about the dog and the letters written by a dog, which also had to be destroyed for practical reasons. But we also get a sense that part of the things that he gets to narrate in that diary, it could also be fictional. It could be purely a figment of his imagination. But what we are certain about is his state of mind, which is continually deteriorating in terms of descent into madness. And by the time the story ends, we get to know that he has been driven completely insane. And what drives him insane is the bureaucratic system, the frustrations of being caught within a system out of which he cannot come out. The focus of this story, rather than being a social critique or rather than being a moral commentary on the ethics of workspace or the relationship between the person and his workspace, it's more psychological in nature. It also needs to be noticed that among Gogol's works, this is the one which is written in the first person narrative. It also gives us a sense of very personal details, very intimate details about the protagonist's state of mind. If there's one emotion which we find rather static from the beginning till the end of this story, that Poprishchin, the protagonist, is angry. He is frustrated with the world. He thinks that the world has done him wrong, and he also thinks that everything around him, every human being around him, every system within which he is placed, they are all there to insult him, to injure him, and he is unable to get out of this paranoia. And he sees himself increasingly as a victim from the beginning, and he is also seeing himself as someone who is suffering in the hands of this cruel world. And to all of this, he can only respond with vengeance, which is all pent up within him. And look at the various ways in which he responds to these people who are around him. For instance, the section chief is reduced to something less than a human being. This is how the section chief is described. He has a face like a druggist bottle, and he's also called a damned heron. And the cashier, on the other hand, is attacked with rumor, which we still do not know whether it's true or not. The madman Poprishchin, who is the protagonist, he reports that at home his cook beats him, and everybody knows it. And even his sense of humor, we find it's very, very aggressive. And his only enjoyment in life, we get to know that, is by from theatre. He goes to watch plays, and he laughs at these amusing plays that he goes to watch. And there he also finds that the authors make jibes at lawyers, collegiate registrars, merchants, and journalists. And this is the kind of thing that he wants to do as well, because he is very unhappy with the systems within which he is placed, and he wouldn't miss a chance to laugh at them. And he's also caught in this vicious circle of paranoia. And he blames his feelings of frustration on others, and he sees threats everywhere, even when there is none. And as we saw in that excerpt, in the first entry on October 3rd, even when he wakes up, that's the first thought that comes to his mind, whether he should go to his office or not. He would rather not go, had it not been for the advance that he wanted to get from the cashier. So he wakes up with this paranoia, wakes up with this negativity that things are bound to go wrong, that he is going to be insulted and humiliated at his workplace. And underneath this paranoia and underneath this aggression, which often is very, very passive too, we find that there is intense envy, intense jealousy. He's always coveting some possession of power, and therein lies the irony of the whole situation. While he finds himself being bogged down by various figures of authority, while he sees himself as a victim of this bureaucratic hierarchy, he also wishes to be at the top. He also wishes to be in that position from where he can dominate others. And this feeling of superiority, which he thinks authority will automatically bring to him, he is continuously coveting that, which is why towards the end he begins to see himself as the king of Spain, which gives him an ultimate sense of authority, ultimate sense of superiority. And throughout the story, we find that this man, who is gradually but very steadily descending into madness, he is always craving for a sense of dignity, for a sense of authority. And this incidentally is also accompanied by a compensatory fantasy of dignity and authority. So halfway through the story, we begin to see, as he also descends into madness, that there are a lot of fantasies that he begins to indulge himself in. And the diary entries, they also become more and more problematic, as in it becomes harder to differentiate between the real things that he is going through and the things that he is fantasizing. But that said, right at the beginning, the sense of paranoia which gets conveyed through these various entries, it also tells us about the innate element of insanity that the protagonist already had. And in the beginning, and even in that, even in the first entry, which is from October 3rd, when he assumes that the others are jealous of him because he's working with the director, we find a sense of awe, a sense of appreciation for the director, and he begins to covet that sort of a position, thinking that things would get better when he is higher up in this ladder of hierarchy, when he has a sense of authority which he can use on the others who work below him. And there's a seamlessness with which he reads news reports, and he also superimposes those incidents which happens in different parts of the world into his own lives. For instance, when he reads this news piece about the vacant Spanish throne, he begins to assume that he has transformed into the king of Spain. And here is where we find real historical and political incidents becoming intertwined with the personal fantasies, and that also accelerates his descent into madness. And in solving what he sees as a political problem by transforming himself into the king of Spain and thereby occupying that vacant position of the throne, he also solves his personal crisis, at least momentarily. In his mind, he assumes this powerful position, which is that of the king of Spain, and he gets a sense of authority, a sense of superiority, which temporarily he feels will also solve the problem. And while the reader can see through the paranoia and the descent into complete madness, we find that at a personal level, it's also very, very gratifying for Bob Rushton. And there's an imagined love quest alongside with this. He is in real life presented as someone who has hardly any appeal in terms of his love relations. But when he is beginning to imagine a sense of authority and a sense of superiority, which these elements of fantasy also bring into his life, there is an imaginary love quest that he begins to pursue as well. And he, in his mind, in his fantasies, he becomes a knight errant in search of his beloved. And Sophie, one of the other characters, is also idealized over here. And there are two kinds of fantasies that we find the protagonist indulging himself in. One is overtly political and the other is erotic. And we find that both are compensatory, the political fantasy and the erotic fantasy. And both of them arise from the need to bolster his own ego, Bob Rushton's ego, which is in a very precarious condition when the story begins. And he is humiliated by the drab retaliates of his daily existence, and there are rejections. He associates himself with a dignified world, but when that fails, he has to take resort in this imagined world, in this world of fantasy. And he thinks that only if he proves himself sexually, even if that's in a fantasy, his entry into this world of authority and this world of superiority will be complete. So throughout the story, this madman Poprishchin, he tends to alternate between these two fantasy worlds, one very political and deeply historical, and the other personal and erotic. And the reality within which he is placed, it's assiduously avoided as well. And that is one of the key features which also endears this text to us, this fierce need to move away from reality so that one would feel comfortable in the fantasy world that one had created for oneself. And that is what Poprishchin does to himself. And this, by extension, one can say that these fantasy worlds, these time slots that he gives himself in some unreal world, they also seem to do a lot of good to him in terms of bolstering his ego. But on the other hand, it also takes him down this path of descent to complete madness, which does not seem to bother him in any way, because he does not really realize that he is descending into insanity. And I would like to make a quick remark of the use of the first person narrative here. The use of the first person narrative also in multiple ways it quarantines reality. And by using the first person narrative, the narrator and by extension the author figure is also directing the paths through which the reader is supposed to traverse. And there's no way in which we can get into the character except through the ways in which the character is taking us through. So here we find that we get a glimpse of Poprishchin's life and the many emotions that he is going through. It's only through the diary entries, but in spite of that, there are certain glimpses of reality that we are allowed to see. For instance, when he talks about the dog and the letters that the dog had written, which obviously is a figment of his imagination, and the letter gets destroyed as well. It gives us a sense of the kind of reality that he's trying to grapple with, and it also tries to convey a certain symbolic act. In the story, through these diary entries, we get to know that Poprishchin gets the dog's letters and he has to destroy them. And the destruction of the dog's letters is a highly symbolic act. And he associates the dog with a certain form of intelligence or a certain form of knowledge which is available to men. To read an excerpt from the short story, have long suspected that dogs are far more intelligent than men. They're extremely politic. They notice everything, every step a man takes. Dogs are clever creatures. They understand all diplomatic relations. So, what Poprishchin in this process is trying to do is to recover the knowledge that supposedly the dog has. This is obviously a figment of imagination, as we would get to know without any further guess. But ironically, even though he always seems to get a hang of the real world out there, he seems to be interested in the world of politics, in the world of history, the complicated world of bureaucracy out there, even though he wants to be in authority, in a position of authority, which will also give him a sense of superiority. One begins to suspect whether he really wants that world or not, whether it's a world that he really needs, which is why the destruction of the dog's letters, which is again something very symbolic. The destruction of these letters, it conveys a lot to us, that in some way Poprishchin is completely blocking any of the ways in which he will be forced to go back to reality, because the dog's letters, which also contains this a sort of which also can possibly function as a bridge between this fantasy world and the real world of politics out there. And by destroying that bridge, Poprishchin is also telling the reader that he is contented, he is happy to live in this world of fantasy, in this mad world, rather than reaching out into the real world. So the letters that he claims to have got, the dog's letters, that is perhaps that last bit of connection that he had with reality. And with the destruction of these letters, we find that even that last bit of touch that he retained with reality is completely destroyed, and that too willfully destroyed. And there's another interesting thing in this narrative that we come across. Through this descent into complete madness, he continues to work in a very real setting. There is a fantasy world where he is playing different roles, including the role of the King of Spain, including this erotic adventurer. But on the other hand, he continues to work at the office. He attends the theatre. He keeps track of the days. And when he destroys the letters, that is when we find the story taking a complete turn altogether. He destroys his one last bit of sanity. I may read out this act of destruction, which is also seen as an act of rebellion over here. It reads like this: "It's always a court chamberlain or a general. Everything that is best in the world falls to the court chamberlains or the generals. If you find some poor treasure and think it is almost within your grasp, a court chamberlain or a general will snatch it from you. God damn it. I would like to become a general myself, not in order to receive her hand and all the rest of it. No, I should like to be a general, only to see how they would wriggle and display all their court manners and equivoques, and then say to them, I spit on you both, oh damn it." And this rebellion happens right after the destruction of those fantasy letters. And this rebellion, one begins to wonder whether this is against the system altogether. We also get to know that it's not that Popristin is fantasizing to be a part of this imaginary world. He wants to be there so that he can get a sense of that authority, he can get a sense of that superiority, and then willfully reject it, which is what the last part of this excerpt also tells us. I spit on you both, oh damn it. Of course, there are two major reasons for this rebellion. One is that he perhaps just seeks a better station for himself within the existing order of things. And the second was that maybe he is rebelling because he has lost Sophie's hand to the court chamberlain, and this in multiple ways it accelerates the kind of disgruntlement and the kind of paranoia that he had in the presence of anything bureaucratic. And on the one hand, in this excerpt where he is actually venting out his anger because he has lost Sophie's favor, we begin to see that he totally loses perspective as well. And of course, it's a madman and we cannot expect too much of an act of rationality from his side. But at the same time, the resentment which began with the rejection of the object of his love, we begin to see that his protest very soon becomes one of sour grapes, because then he wants revenge and then he wants to wield power over the ones who are oppressing him. So we begin to suspect all the sincerity of the emotions that he has been trying to convey right from the beginning. And we also see this intense desire within him to transform from being a victim towards being a victimizer. And his interest in Sophie, incidentally, was never amorous. And his erotic desires, as we noted from the beginning, those erotic desires were aroused by his feelings of humiliation and also to assert himself and from his need to prove his superiority to the others. So Sophie, in his mind, was his last chance to prove that he is a man, to prove that he can be superior to others, to prove that he can assert himself. So the descent into madness becomes quite complete with this event of him losing Sophie as well. And towards the end, the dividing line between reality and fantasy begins to fade, and the madman no longer knows who he is. And then the stage is set for sort of a metamorphosis. And that's when he has this complete descent into madness, where he begins to fantasize, he begins to imagine himself as the king of Spain. And here there is a replacement at the motive level as well. The sexual motive gets completely replaced by the political motive. So the story is also about a sense of identity, about concern for social image and self-image. We find that Popristin feels alienated socially as well as at a personal level, and he feels alienated from the world within which he is placed. He also feels alienated from his own being, and his fantasy quest for power, for love, all of these represent his search for a public as well as a private identity, because there is no place where he feels at home, where he feels that he is in control. Both in the public and private realms, he feels that he's no longer in control. He feels that he never could assert himself. So through the political fantasies and through the erotic fantasies, what he is trying his best is to assert himself as a man, to assert himself as someone who is completely in control of the things around him. And the sense of vengeance and the sense of paranoia and every single emotion that he begins to develop is all a result of this. So of course the starting point is the frustration with the bureaucratic systems within which he is placed, but we also begin to see that there could be other deep-rooted issues, psychological issues, which the text partially deals with and leaves it open for the reader's imagination to a very large extent. And we also find that it's very difficult for a reader to like this character, to like Poprishchin. We do not feel much of a sympathy for him. On the other hand, he comes across as this man, the madman who's caught in his own self-centered and solipsistic, a madman who's caught in his own self-centered and solipsistic world of diaries, and his masturbation fantasies, his dreams of glory, and everything is part of a fantasy for him. And even the little bridge, the little connection that he has with reality, he doesn't want to acknowledge them. He would rather destroy that bridge completely. And there's also this obsessive phrase that he keeps writing, "I am a noble man," and eventually we see that that also becomes his death knell. So today we wrap up this lecture with these introductory notes. In the next session, we should also take a look at some of the other diary entries in detail to see how Gogol has used this technique of realism and how he has used the first-person narrative to convey something which could be later seen as quite universal as well. So with this, we wrap up this lecture. I thank you for listening and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.